Okay, so tonight we're picking up towards the end of chapter 1. We're on page 32. Just have a couple pages left. We'll wait till the texts get handed out.
I have a question about last week. Can you elaborate a little bit more about mind and thoughts?
Mind and thought, like, be more specific.
Yes. Let's say I'm not quite sure what it is. Let's say that we have to have the mind, we have to have the brain in order for it to. I would like to clarify or elaborate, differentiate a little bit the difference between mind and thoughts. Let's say if we have the brain, in order for the mind to exist, what about thoughts? What constitutes for thought to exist? And let's say if the brain dies, the mind will cease to exist. How about thoughts?
Wow, okay. That's a very seemingly simple question, but it's very, very complicated. I'm willing to go into it a little bit at the risk of diving into some deep water, and not with the idea that I'd have a definitive answer on this, but maybe see if I can map out some of the questions behind the question you're asking. If people are interested in this, I mean, it's basically what's the intersect here between, we could say, is contemporary science and these teachings, because when you use the brain, you're talking about something that's sort of in the purview of contemporary science. The text here doesn't mention the brain. If you go, most of the Buddhist texts I've read, I don't think I can think of a single one that mentions the brain. And that's interesting in itself, that we have an idea of the brain as being central to our understanding of who we are and how we operate. If you want to say our consciousness and our thoughts are brain-centered. And yet these texts don't seem to mention anything like the brain. So that's why I say it's a complicated question, but if people are interested, we could look into it a little bit before we go into the text. Yes? No?
Sure. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, here goes. Where to begin? First, maybe I could say that this text and the Buddhist texts in general, or a lot of these texts that are coming from this tradition, Southeast Asian, have very elaborate and very systematic and very detailed descriptions and categories and analysis of what you would, for want of a better word, call mind or consciousness or thought. In fact, they devote an incredible amount of attention to this. And so it's very developed and very, as I say, systematic, and the use of the language and the words is also very precise. And then when we come into, say, our Western scientific-based, for want of a better word, modern scientific-based culture, sometimes we use those same words and they don't at all mean the same thing. So mind, consciousness, thought, in the context of this text we're reading, doesn't necessarily mean the same thing of mind or consciousness in a Western scientific sense. So the first thing we have to be clear about is we may not be comparing apples to apples or pears to pears. So that's the first level of complexity. The other is the very means by which you analyze and know and probe this are different methodologies as well. They're not the same. So brain science or neuroscience has a series of paradigms they use to inquire into the nature of something. And they purposely limit it to what is observable through certain kinds of tools and instruments. And they control the variables so that they can limit the field to a focus of study. So a lot of phenomena that we would consider very interesting, and maybe phenomena that's being talked about here, that come about through precepts and concentration and meditation techniques, wouldn't necessarily be what they're looking into. They might be looking into something that's, in a sense, mechanistic, reducible to matter, physical properties only. So again, the field of inquiry is not necessarily the same either. So now you have the second layer of complexity. That's why it's, I mean, I'm really interested in this. I've been spending some time thinking about it. My little, as my niece says, my little poo brain, bear brain. I just have a small brain, but it's fascinating. And it's probably one of the major areas of the encounter between, say, Buddhism and the modern world is through the scientific thought ways that are out there. And yet at the same time, I must say, we're not even at the beginning of the frontier of the exploration of this, I don't feel. I mean, a lot of people are very hopeful that these two are just going to come together in some one great new unified field of understanding. And I used to, at one time, have a fantasy like that, but the more I look into it, I realize it's not going to be that simple for a lot of reasons. So at the same time, there's fascinating parallels and correspondences between the two, if you think of them as disciplines of inquiry, but there's also real big divergences too. I mean, just to state an obvious one, from the Buddhist point of view, you can't know things clearly until you have clear conscience. You have to have a clear moral, ethical frame of mind. That's one of the controlled variables. So if you're going to do the experiment to replicate the awakening experience of a Buddha, one of the fundamental prerequisites is sila, or a kind of virtue, where you clear your mind, your body, mind, mouth, karma, to the point that it's not creating ways of obstruction to understanding. Then you bring your mind to a certain focus and attention and equanimity. You could say like adjusting the microscope for focus. And then the third thing is you have clarity about the nature of things. Well, that's a very different methodology than, say, a scientist might use for an experiment. The first one about your own personal, moral, ethical, emotional stability and equanimity would not necessarily be a consideration. You just go to the lab and you do your thing. And there's no sense that those would interfere or in some ways affect the outcomes of your research and so forth. It's not even a variable that's considered to be necessary to get. So you could see why there's just many levels here of differences. That being said, it's worth looking into because, in a sense, I would argue, and I have made this argument before and gotten away with it, so I'll try it again. I would argue that the biggest interface, say with Buddhism, the kind of Buddhism we're doing here, and the modern contemporary world is not going to be through other religions. I don't think that's the encounter. I think the encounter is between the scientific, technological mindset and that. That's a much more formative religion, if you want to use that word, of how we look at reality and how we inform ourselves than, say, our religious beliefs. And in some way, many religious beliefs have sort of been eroded away by advances in science. so that people are less and less certain of religious truths and more leaning to scientific truth as the ground of their thinking. It's sort of like if you turn on the TV, and you all have TVs or whatever, and you kind of flip around, you'll see on Sunday all these shows, religious shows, people up there preaching and whatnot. And if you're like most people, you're going, yeah, blah, blah. You just go through. And then, but you get to some saying, and there's some guy with a white coat on and says, research shows. And you're like, laboratory studies prove. And immediately you're, sort of faith-based. If I can use that, you trust that. Whereas the religious claims, exclusive claims or this and that, you kind of take at best with a grain of salt or just ignore them. So I'm just saying there's been a shift in consciousness to where we think is authoritative. And in a sense, where we take to be authoritative is a definition of religion, what we steer by, So that's why I think it's a really important discussion. There's a famous 20th century philosopher, someone called Alfred North Whitehead. Maybe some of you have heard about him. He was very interested in Buddhism. But he said the biggest challenge of the modern era, meaning the 20th and 21st century, will be the coming to terms of religion and science, or not. But he said that's going to be the most determining factor of modern development, is how these two get along or don't. And he said because so powerful are the technologies and the control of nature that science gives us in our lives, and so influential are the structures of making sense and the values that religion or spiritual give us, that these two will be in the most dynamic of exchanges to determine how we go. So there's that thought out there, and then a lot of people think that Buddhism and science will be that new one, that will be the most compatible. So anyhow, how to go into this a little more. Let me do a little mapping here of, there's kind of three different words that are used when the Buddhism talks about the mind, and they don't use the brain. Okay, so we're going to have to put aside the brain for now, figuratively speaking. Although, if we may have brain transplants in our life, and that's interesting. But put aside your brain for now, and think of it, when Buddhism talks about mind or consciousness or thought, what are they talking about there? So one of the terms that's used is vijnana, and you've heard that word before, okay? So what I'm going to try to map out just a little bit is like how it's looked at from the Buddhist side. And vijnana is Sanskrit, and please correct my pronunciations. That's okay, that's fine, okay. In Chinese, it's shi. Vijnana is shi, the character shi. Is that a fourth tone? Yes. I have to have Sanskrit and Chinese corrected. And some of you are biting your tongues to get at my English, but hold on. And so roughly translates English into consciousness, okay? That's usually the translation of it. And sometimes then what's described is, but it's not just, when you asked your question, you did this, like brain, consciousness, thought, and that's sort of the location, that's the location of the brain. But is it the location of consciousness? And the answer is no, not completely at all, a little bit. So the brain, if you could say, probably is part of consciousness. Where it fits exactly is an interesting question, but it's not the seat of consciousness. Okay, so now I'm bringing brain back in a little bit. So what they mean, what it means by consciousness is it's basically there's 6 major areas of awareness. Let's use consciousness as awareness. We're aware. To be conscious is to be aware. And these refer to awareness of the phenomena of the observable universe. Okay? And so eyes, ears, nose, taste, tactile, touch, and then this interesting third one called, and this is also called a consciousness, but it's called manas consciousness, manas or manovijnana. And so I won't give the technical terms, but the consciousness is distributed in its awareness functions with the eye, the ear, the nose, tongue, taste. So consciousness is sensory at this level. It's the sensory apparatus by which we observe our world. And that's all part. So the mind-body thing is not separate here. You don't have a Descartesian sense of saying, oh, the mind is something and then there's its body. But in this, they're interrelated. So that's one way where consciousness appears as. But then this mono-consciousness, it's not directly associated with a physical organ. So it's not the brain. See, this is where people might go and say, oh, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and brain. But mono-consciousness is not the brain because it's not a physical organ. Oh. So it's not like the eyes and nose. It's a kind of a mental consciousness. And it suggests that you can know things with it that are both physical and non-physical. So what's, the physical we know, it's capable of direct perception, but it's also capable of thinking, imagining, conjuring up. And in a sense, it doesn't rely on any materiality to work. So you can have memory, can be a function of that. Inference, imagination, fantasy. You see, it can conjure up things that materially don't really exist, but it still is a sensory apparatus for both physical and non-physical. So it's not really a brain. So that's the first thing. This is that Vijnana idea. And we'll see this in this text when he says here, just for example, on page 32, your original mind, just purify your original mind so that the six consciousnesses go out the six sensory gates, yet remain undefiled and don't mix with the dust. So the six consciousnesses are eye, ears, nose, tongue, body, and this one. And the six gates are the organs. And the six objects are sight, sound, smell, smell. So it's describing a kind of functioning of body and mind as a consciousness thing. Still no brain, though. Okay? So then the next idea maybe is this thing called chitta. I think it's chitta. 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 Not cheetah, but chit.
Not a cheetah. You sound like you're talking about cheetah.
Like a cat.
Yeah. No,
it's
chitta.
It's a chitta.
Chitta.
Okay, chitta. So chitta is a different way of looking at it, and in Chinese this is xin. The three dots and a hook. Xin? Yes. Yeah, okay. Xin, first tone. And this is a little different concept. In some ways, it corresponds to the last four of the five skandhas. So you've heard me do the five skandhas before you. So you have form, which is physicality, rupa. Okay? And the other four are all regarding something more mental. And sometimes shin is used to cover all four of those. So thoughts, feelings, thoughts, samskara, which is more like conceptualizations, but habitual deep tendencies and formations, and then finally vijnana, which is consciousness. So sometimes shin is used to cover all four of those. So the problem, again, with looking at these Buddhist sources is that they don't exactly all agree. I mean, they have kind of a field that they're looking at this through, but they don't necessarily all agree on the... And this is where it starts to get tricky. Okay, this is where it starts to get tricky, because you asked mind, thought, brain. Because chitta can be used both synonymously with this idea of manas, of what you'd call mentality, but also with consciousness, vijnana. It can cover and include both of those. And so it gets complicated in that you're talking about different functions of consciousness, awareness, and whatnot, distributed over the sense organs. And then if you go even further, where he's going, and where the Avatamsaka Sutra goes, they'll actually say that distinction between materiality and mentality is a false dichotomy. Uh-oh. In Now, if you understood what I just said, there is no out there that's different from in here. So sometimes it's phrased in the text of there's no body and mind inside, no world outside. Doesn't mean they don't exist. They do, but they don't exist as separate, distinct realities. They're completely interpenetrating without obstruction, mutually. Like, whoa, I can't wrap my what? I can't wrap my brain, my mind around that. And yet the text would say, well, your mind is around it right now. You're just not aware of it. They would reverse it on you. So in that sense, some of the teachings, what you could call it Yogacara or Avatamsaka school or whatnot, they say this distinction between me, myself, in this outside world, my brain and consciousness and phenomena outside is artificial. It's not real. It's a fabrication, a construction. It's an imagined fabrication. And these are like the dreams that we create. So it's like what it's saying is there's a consciousness, sometimes called the seventh consciousness, that actually creates this false sense of self in the inside and outside. And this is constantly going on and takes some work and effort. So again, there's not necessarily a brain here. So, again, it gets more complicated. So you have manas, you have chitta, you have vijnana, and sometimes they're used interchangeably, sometimes they're all over the place, and sometimes they're very specific. And so the question I'm asking myself, so I dove into this, now I better backpedal a little bit. I don't know the answer to this question. And I'm always surprised, the people I most respect, because they say what I'm saying, which is, oops, but they say, we don't know the answer. And I think that's the honest answer. So whether you're looking at it from a Buddhist point of view, and to say, well, I understand the Buddhist point of view. Well, the text would say, no, you don't. No, we don't until we're fully awakened. So this text will say, until you let go of all your attachments and your confused thinking, and you get rid of all your defiled klesha and so forth, you don't really understand this. You think you understand that, but you don't. Because the understanding of this has to be direct, unmediated by even thought and conceptualization. So what this text is pointing us to is that it's assuming there's some innate, whole and complete state of mind or use of mind that is prajna wisdom, that is complete without anything lacking and knows and sees things perfectly and clearly. It's called all wisdom. And that capacity, when that is activated, then sees how it all works. Up to then, we're using categories and trying to piece them in based on conceptualization and attachment. So the goal of this is to get rid of the coverings over that functioning of the fullness of mind so that everything becomes clear, lustrous, bright, translucent, without any obstruction whatsoever. The text is proposing that is understanding, Buddhist mind. In other words, it's understood through realization, not through conceptualization. And so the conceptualizations are kind of fun, and you can do a whole dissertation or 10 on these. But the real thing they're trying to point to is say these are just conceptions we're trying to use to point you to the real function of this mind. Now, the interesting thing they're proposing is that the confused, upside down, befuddled mind is also the Buddha mind. So they're not two different things. It's just one mind either being used inappropriately, dysfunctionally, or using very appropriately and functionally, and that's why they say it's just like ice and water. Wow. Now, where is that located? Well, it's just behind the occipital region of the... No, see, this is where you go. It doesn't have a location. So when it says, oh, materiality, mentality, these are false dichotomies. Well, somebody asked last week, so are you suggesting that I am not located? And I said, yeah. But it's not me. This is just saying when it says don't dwell anywhere. Why? Because you can't. There's no place you can dwell, because any place you dwell is a place of impermanence and flux and change. And you who are dwelling are also an object of impermanence, flux, and change. So the very notion of a me that dwells is confusion on top of confusion. So if you've been through the earthquakes the last couple of weeks here, you realize, well, this is not necessarily a stable dwelling place. not just California, this whole little speck floating in the void, is not very stable. And then you say, well, I'm dwelling in my place on the speck. Well, come on, this is crazy. You know, sell insurance on that basis. And then you say, well, but I am dwelling, so who is the I? And then you go into this Buddhist thing and it starts to take this whole thing apart, and the very conceptualization of a permanent, unchanging, eternal me is also a fabrication. So that's where it's pushing the envelope a little bit. Now, or a lot, depending on how you look at it. But again, where do we put the brain? I don't know. I mean, I could speculate and say, okay, the brain must be part of rupa, right? Because it's a thing. You all know that. The brain's this convoluted, so it's a thing. So it's got to be part of rupa. Earth, air, fire, water, right? But it's also part of consciousness. Because if you change the brain, you can change consciousness, right? Everybody, we know that. You've seen all the experiments. But what's really interesting, if you change consciousness, you can change the brain. Oh. So you look at someone like Richie Davidson at Madison with his Neuroscience Center. He's taking these protocols from Buddhist practitioners like the Dalai Lama and using interesting states of chanting and meditation and then mapping out what happens to the brain. And you can actually see corresponding changes in the brain through functional MRI and things like that. You say, whoa, wait a minute. So we can change the brain and we shift our consciousness, right? A stroke or things like associated with Alzheimer's, or the breaking up of the neuron endings, as they sort of fray, then memory and identity can actually evaporate right before our eyes. One day I know you, the next day I don't. One day I'm at home, the next day I have no idea where I am. That's a change in the brain, change in consciousness. But by changing consciousness, you can also change the brain. So there's one area that the two disagree, which is on the concept of what's called neuroplasticity. And plasticity means flexibility, like clay. So it can shift and change. The brain is not some fixed thing. So what Buddhism is suggesting, though, is a neuroplasticity that goes beyond the material. It's actually saying that all realms of existence, from the hells and animals and ghosts up to devas and buddhas and bodhisattvas, is a neuroplasticity line of transformation that we're capable of. So it's not just saying I can't remember the street I'm living on. You can actually change your actual physical form by a change of consciousness. Now this gets into the notion of karma, which I don't know if that's being investigated yet through the neuroscience. But that would be an interesting area where you'd have to, how would you do that? How does conscious, intentional action of body, mind, and mouth actually change physical responses? Now the texts are saying with certain thoughts that become habitual, you actually move out of a human body over a period of time and space that again is more quantum-like than physical, and you can change and transform into different realms of being. You can become an animal. Now there's some abiding consciousness that carries over, but it's you talk about not functioning very well. It's really not functioning very well at that point, but it's still a continuation of consciousness that you have. So now we're really stretching, and where's the brain fit in that? So in some ways people look at the brain from a computer model, that it's a processor. So the brain is processing stimuli from sense organs and interpreting and so on and so forth, and that's one way to look at it. And you could say to some extent consciousness is kind of like that, but it's not exactly like that either. So I'm just kind of thinking out loud here. It's really interesting. The two guys, and really credit goes to the woman who did all the hard work. But, the two guys who came up with the double helix model, Watson and Crick. Watson in the last 5 or 6 years has completely switched over his attention from genetics to neuroscience. It's very interesting, and I saw an interview with him, and what he was saying was, we thought we had it with genetics. We thought that was the breakthrough that would explain the human and everything. And he said, but then his son went insane. I think maybe schizophrenia or something, and maybe took his own life. And this completely stopped his world. He said, here I am doing all this research, understanding the intricacies of the genetic thing, and I have no clue as to what happened, why my son did that. What caused that? He said, I have no model to explain it. He said, in many ways, we're on the bright edges of research on many things, but in the area of the mind and consciousness, we're not even in the Middle Age, we're not even in the Stone Age yet in terms of our understanding. So he's taking a lot of the money that he's acquired through that and transferring over and trying to set up some way to look at this. So it's just an example of the interest and at the same time the lack of understanding we have. So I don't know where you put the brain. Let me just. How do I say?
Excuse me.
Yes, ask a question more.
Is it not possible to simplify it and think of mind as a virtual container for sensory, perceptive, and made up or thoughts, cognitions, things?
See, we use metaphors. If you use container, then I'm thinking like something that has, but the description in the text here is say it doesn't have boundaries. It doesn't have, and so in a sense you can, but it's a limited metaphor because it implies some kind of location or some kind of thing to it. And what this is what the text seems to be talking about is consciousness. Our consciousness is a distributed property that doesn't have any location and doesn't have any boundaries. And it's like, so the part of us that wants to set up in some kind of self and that just shakes at that possibility. It's like, it sounds cool. And then you go home at night and you say goodnight to yourself and it's not so cool anymore. It's like, I'm scared, there's no me. If I don't wake up in the morning, where will I be? That kind of thing. So it's hard to come up with anything. And that's why the texts always say, whatever language we use to try to get a description of this, a container, a field, whatnot, it is a borrowed false term that only points to something that might be true, but don't mistake with a pointer for the true. So the text will actually say all concepts, words, and language are basically false and unreliable. But we use the false and unreliable to point to what is true, and the famous Chan thing is the finger pointing to the moon. So the finger points to the moon, but the finger isn't the moon. So we can come up with that idea. If that actually works, I don't know if that's...
That's why I use, with caution, virtual container.
But you see, when we talk, we're all doing this body language with quote, and whatnot, and I think that suggests something. So let me suggest a couple areas where I think there might be some interest here between the brain and consciousness. One is that they obviously interact. So one changes, the other changes. By the way, and it's not just the brain. It's really interesting. We say, if you have a change in the brain, consciousness changes. If you have a change in the eyes, in the ears, in the nose, in your taste, consciousness also changes. So just look at Oliver Sacks's work. That's really wonderful, where he says there's a change in the eyes. For example, you lose color in your eyes. Your consciousness then changes. Food that looked good before looks like crap now. Looks terrible to you, and you can't eat it. You're nauseated by just looking at it. So if you just have black and white and you look at some food, it doesn't look so good, right? And your idea of what's ripe and good or bad is consciousness shifts on that. So he described the artist who was drawing these wonderful color palettes and then had a brain injury and lost color and only could see in black and white. And so he would try with his colors, he'd mix them and put them on like he did before, but he couldn't really see, and people would come in and say, oh my God, that's ugly, terrible. And he was thinking of killing himself because he could no longer work with color. His consciousness was no longer able to take in color. And then he was driving down the streets of New York for some reason on a very smoggy day, and he saw the sun up, but it was so shadowed by smog that it was only black and white. You know those kind of days, right? The sun's there, but it's really not yellow. And he just did that, and that sold for $5,000. And he thought, I'm onto something here. And so he started to just work with black and whites and shades of gray. And he reinvented his whole self around a shift of consciousness that occurred with that. And about 10 years down this road, he was going, and they finally found a way to correct the thing that threw him off in the first place. And so the neurologist came back to him and said, hey, look, we can get you back. And he went, I don't want to change. He didn't want to change back to seeing color again because he was so successful in that. So Sachs has a lot of things like this. The one I'm thinking of that's really interesting is a person called Jacques Lucéran, who lost his eyes and then shifted his consciousness completely. So it's a really fascinating story. If you want to read a really interesting book, the book about this is called Against the Pollution of the Eye. And the eye is the ego eye, capital I. And it's a sort of autobiographical. He was a little boy in France, maybe in second or third grade, had a wonderful family, very bright, and he was running, and somehow with a pencil he fell, and the pencil jammed in to the eye and hit the optical nerve and severed it for both eyes. And he went from that to not being able to see. And it's very interesting. He went home, and his parents were really very supportive, very interesting parents, and they said, you are not handicapped. They told him right off, you are not handicapped because you lost your eyes. Moreover, the world that will open to you without eyes is so wonderful and fantastic that you have to share it with us every day and tell us what you are discovering. I mean, that kind of response of the parents shifted him completely to think, oh, I'm excited. I'm going to see things, with my ears and so forth. And so over time, he developed a sensitivity of being able to, quote, see without his eyes. He was echolocation for one. His ears developed so finely that he could tell distance and density and male or female even approaching on the basis of just sound. But he said, I had to concentrate my mind in order to open that faculty of sound. But he was able to do that. He said, moreover, people say to me, oh, we're so sorry you can't see. He says, I just can't see with my eyes. He says, you're the ones that are blind. Whoa. He says, because you can't see with your ears. You can't see with your skin. And he said, seeing with your eyes is a limited perception. Now, what's interesting about him is he was in France during the Nazi occupation. He was 17 or 18 at the time, and he became a leader of the underground resistance. And as you know, the underground resistance was often tried to be penetrated by the Nazis with spies and plants that then could detect them and expose them. And so the skill of any underground operation had to do with vetting who was coming to volunteer to make sure they weren't agents of the Nazis or collaborators with the Nazis. And all those organizations lost many, many good people because they were not successfully able to detect. He never, in his, lost anybody. And they let him do the interviews. And when he did the interviews, because he was blind, he would ask questions. And he said, by the sound and everything in their voice, I could tell who was true and who was false. I could tell who was phony and who was right on. And interesting, statistically, they never lost anybody to an infiltrator. He spotted it right at the beginning without his eyes. And he survived the concentration camps without his eyes. So it's an amazing story. But what I'm sort of pointing out was the shift in consciousness that occurred with a change in an organ wasn't just a brain. In other words, his eyes changed and a whole different field of consciousness arose. So that's what I mean by it's really fascinating, the plasticity. But in any event, there's just interesting things to read. The other thing is that both neuroscience, as far as I can tell now, and I'm trying to keep up with it a little bit, but it's technical language, so I'm always a little stymied. So those of you who have this skill, you want to study up on it and share with us, I really appreciate it. But I do understand that at least the latest neuroscience is, like Buddhism, rejecting the notion of a self. It does not posit a self in the conventional way we think of it, an eternal, autonomous being at the center of experience and existence. They do not posit that at all. In fact, they say we can't find it. When we do the neuroscience, we see a distributed phenomena, and we don't see a self. The self is an illusion. but a tenacious one. They admit that. Of course, scientists don't have that anymore. See, no, of course, they still have their cells. It also rejects a dualism of inner and outer, of what you could say, this world and that, inside and outside. They reject, so this is neuroscience and Buddhism, both reject that dualism. They both assert, to some level, that the world as we perceive it is a grand illusion. It's not as it really is. So that's talking about, then, from the neuroscience point of view, we are not passive observers like in a movie theater watching a screen with phenomena that we record, but we're interacting with what we're observing. They use the language they use is visually manipulated, auditorily manipulated, tactilely manipulated. We are, in a sense, emotionally, culturally, every which way, manipulating a reality interactively and not simply passively observing it. Moreover, the neuroscience say something very interesting in terms of Buddhism. If you stop manipulating, it disappears. You see nothing. When you stop manipulating some aspect of the world, it draws back into nothingness. Now that's very Buddhist in a sense. About, if you think about, now I'm sure there's more advances and this is moving along, but it's really interesting to see at least these correspondences. So what they would say probably is brain is kind of an interesting thing, but it's not really the most interesting thing. What's more interesting is, what's the relationship between brain and consciousness? Does brain direct consciousness, or does consciousness direct the brain? And the Buddhist point of view is, to what extent does then karma direct consciousness? And so these are really, you asked seemingly a simple question, but it's not. I don't know the answers. I'm fascinated by it. I may not live to see major breakthroughs in this area, but I think we're on the cusp of something. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up about the neuroscience?
Sure.
But some of what you just described sounds like they actually were able to get their mitts around something they could chew on. That's a total mixed metaphor. But, I mean, things like there being no distinction between inside and outside. I'm imagining they actually came up with some evidence. But when they were saying they couldn't find any evidence of self, that to me sounds more like we're in the territory of science still can't even get there. There's nothing to study. I mean, what are the indicia of self that they could even look at? Did they find anything? Was there like something they were probing for? Or?
Well, they're looking for sort of this autonomous center that interprets, that observes, that filters, blah, blah, blah. As, and they use the metaphor like you're in the theater and you're sitting there and you're watching the screen. But what they're actually saying, the way it works neurologically, is that what's on the screen is both you're perceiving it, but you're also projecting it simultaneously. So what they're saying is, if you don't manipulate and select down based on memory, inference, values, fears, so on and so forth, reality just becomes this soup of phenomena. And so we think, through the process of manipulating down, either through psychologically, culturally, or whatnot, we now have a grasp of reality. But what that is we've done that through selective perceptions. Selective attention, selective inattention. So in fact, what we're doing with consciousness is not taking in the whole thing, but actually collapsing it down to something that's manageable. And from the Buddhist point of view, it's manageable to a self that wants to feel as if it isn't the center in control and the subject of this. So the illusion of the self then creates the basis for the manipulation that reinforces that. And so when you meditate or when you die, the movie ends. It ends while you're dying. And the part of the process of dying is this manipulated reality starts to melt, evaporate, dissolve. And that's why if you've been meditating and cultivating for a long time, you can have some equanimity at that point because you're not entering something that's totally unexpected. But if you've been hard and fast clinging to this, then it's just like watching an ice cube in the sun. Try as you may, it's not going to stay solid. It's going to dissolve. So the process of dying, those 5 skandhas start to lose their hold. The form loses its hold, right? The physical part starts to lose its hold. Then your feelings start to change and lose their grip and start to be irrelevant. Then your thoughts, your perceptions, your cognition starts to, and gradually, you're just down to a loose consciousness working. And even at that point, it's really hard to make everything gel again. But this is where perhaps science could get something out of this process I just described, but at the very least, what they're just saying is there's no objective self that impartially and objectively sees, that it is by nature subjective and partial and biased. It's partially biased by the limitations of the sense organs to begin with. We only see, hear, and smell within a certain range, and we naively say, that's the world. But elephants and bats would tell you, no, you're not getting it all, okay? But that's one way it's manipulated, done, just by the limitations of senses. And then psychologically, we further bring it down and further bring it down. So what's being described here is a collapsing of this consciousness that the Sixth Patriarch is talking about. And what the Sixth Patriarch is talking about is by taking that off, consciousness expands to its full potential, so shrinking, expanding. Ironically, by busy act of manipulating, we're shrinking it. And by stillness, we're opening it up. By stopping its mad activity, it starts to re-expand again. It's really kind of paradoxical. Wow. Anyhow, yes?
I completely understand what you're saying, but then in that case, does that mean that, say, someone who follows someone their entire life, or say, a loved one who watches you and knows you very well, does that mean that they would not have a sense of what your self is as well? Am I making sense?
So they would not know.
I understand that you would not.
You know your
sense of yourself.
right.
Because you're forever changing and you're very biased and you're kind of ignorant as well about yourself because you're so biased. But what if somebody were to study you your entire life, or a loved one, say maybe your mate who knows you inside and out and follows you and says, oh, I know you're changing right now based on this, or you're getting into, this romanticism because of this, or and knows your ins and outs and how you
Right.
change. And would somebody else be able to know your sense of self?
That's an interesting question, because I guess maybe from the neuroscience side, but maybe also the Buddhist side, the neuroscience side would say this is one of the functions of consciousness. It creates a unity. It tries to create a unity and continuity. That's part of its manipulation. So what it does is that it strings together event, emotion, experience, and makes a narrative that is held together. Now, if there's day-to-day contact or regular contact, you can kind of maintain that. But if you're separate from too long, I don't know you exactly anymore, and this is what happens in relationships. There's strained ones on the East Coast, one that when someone goes off to war for 5 or 6 years and comes back, they've gone on with a continuity that's internal to themselves, makes complete sense. And yet they come back and somebody else says, whoa, who are you? And so unless we have that day-to-day reification in relationship, we can actually just find ourselves, and we're integral to ourselves, but we've changed into relationship to each other. Moreover, this can happen to yourself. For example, people that are put in solitary confinement with no relationships whatsoever can lose self profoundly, and not in a Buddhist sense of no self, but in a very dysfunctional psychological malfunctioning, because the reference points, the continuity isn't there without relationships. So the very notion of a me has to bounce off a continuity of experiences, and this is called, we construct it by inference and memory. If those get interrupted, the self itself no longer has a container sort of to hold it. So we are like ether, in a sense. As long as we're in the container, there's a there. You open the container and it just starts to go. You can see this also with children. You think you know a child, like my niece thinks she knows her children, and then they have this incredible traumatic brain transformation called teens. And they get there and it's like Jekyll and Hyde. Who is this kid that I don't know this person anymore? And because the transformation is so rapid, both hormonally and physiologically, that they are indeed becoming different beings. And we try to hold on to that. We try to, so a lot of what they'd say, a lot of human activity consists of creating containers and experiences that can hold together the fragility of that. Reunions, family gatherings, all of these things are set up to try to maintain the continuity and the unity of that. But you know this too, if you go to another culture, another time, your own inner sense, you start to have a kind of shock of who I am, where I belong, and whatnot. So all Buddhism is saying is that this is the nature of things because there wasn't any self there to begin with. However, penetrating through that is not anxiety and stress, but it's actually liberation. If you do it in a constructed way where you are following a methodology and supposed to happen to you when you didn't volunteer to lose yourself. Involuntary loss of self is not good, okay? And I've had people come and say, yeah, my friend here is like totally crazy. They've been in a mental ward, and I think they're almost close to enlightenment. No. Because to deconstruct yourself, you have to have a good, strong one to begin with. You don't deconstruct it from fragility and not having it. It's kind of an irony. And the no self that's talking about here is actually a higher functioning of the self. It's a liberated growth from self to no self, but it's not coming from an inadequate harmed humanity than trying to, because you'd have to restore the self first. Then from there, you can go to the other. So this is very complex stuff, your simple question. Just kind of got a chain going tonight. I don't know if you all find this as interesting as I do, but it is really fascinating. And I think we're at the beginning of this. And and I would say, try to keep up on this. If you're interested in the neuroscience, go ahead. But more importantly, do the inner science. do these techniques and methods, because I think these have the potential of at least the greatest breakthrough, and even maybe the potential of actually beginning to have the two come together. So I would deeply enter this one. That would be, now we're out of time. A construct of the mind as well. However, I have to say, next week's our last class for the semester, so we have one more class left, and I will try to then finish up the one chapter. So we're going to go into I think this is the first section of verses, where he does verses. So we'll finish up this section and the verses next Friday, and then we take a break. I take a break. I don't know what you all do. So my first break, I'm going to go with Hung Sure down to Gethsemane in Kentucky. It was Thomas Merton's Trappist monastery, and we're going to have a kind of Buddhist Trappist contemplative dialogue and exchange and stuff. So that should be interesting. That's going to be in May. And then in June, I'm going to disappear and do writing and really enter the world of words and thoughts. And then July, I'm going to leave that world completely of worlds and thoughts and just go up to Maine, where we have no electricity, and I will spend probably a month in a kayak with a really sweet Chesapeake Bay retriever. So it'll be me, dog, and kayak for July. So from words to wordlessness, and then if I'm still in shape, we'll be back. Huh? Yeah. If I can find my way back, we'll be back to start this up again in the fall, and we'll continue the Friday night class. So I hope all of you have interesting plans or prospects for the summer. But I must say, if you can find some time in the space coming up to unplug in significant ways, it'd be really quite restorative. But enough. We'll do the transfer. Any announcements? Nothing? Just the normal schedule? Okay. I think some people are new. They might want to know the schedule.
Okay, we have daily meditation tomorrow, and 9 o'clock it will be recitation Universal Door Chapter, Lotus Sutra. Lunch, 1 o'clock is Amitabha Buddha's recitation. Evening ceremony, and 7:30 Avatamsaka Sutra lecture.
Okay, we're going to do a transference in English now. Do people need a copy? Okay. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may their minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of their endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Ding li san bao.